A much disgusted man was Rose when he returned. His stock was gone. His furniture was gone. His house was filled with filthy clothing and vermin. His supply of drinking water polluted with dead bodies. Nothing left of his farm but the rocks and some soil. Hello, I'm Tim Smith with Gettysburg History, and welcome to another episode of our Gettysburg 162. And here we're going to highlight another farm on the battlefield. And of course, this is the Rose Farm, or what I like to call the bloodiest farm in American history. Now, when people talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, they often talk about the town of Gettysburg. But most of the fighting took place in Cumberland Township, Adams County, which really consisted of no major towns, just individual farms, usually between like 50 and 300 acres. And the farm we're talking about today is the Rose Farm. At the time of the battle, it was about 230 acres of land, and it was owned by George Rose. George Rose lived in Germantown near Philadelphia and not in Gettysburg at the time of the battle. His brother was the tenant of the farm named John Rose. So this fact has led to a little confusion over the years. A tenant farmer also lived here, and in the 1860 census, he's listed Francis Ogden. And it's obvious that he was here during the battle because he places a claim for damages for some of the crops that he was in charge of. Although this tract will always be known as the Rose Farm, it has a much more complicated history. George Rose did not purchase the farm until 1858. The farm, this piece of land, was first settled by Robert McCreary. He died early on. His son, Robert McCreary Jr., took over. It was owned by a guy named Quentin Armstrong for a while. But it wasn't until 1805 that Jacob Scherfig, or Scherfy, acquired the patent deed. Jacob and his wife, Catherine, raised 11 children here, one of which was Joseph Scherfy, who in 1842 purchased land on the Emmitsburg Road, not part of the original Scherfig family tract. And actually, he's the one who owned the peach orchard here at the time of the battle, and that is part of the original tract. So when Joseph Scherfig got the property, it was 350 acres, and it included the land with a northern boundary today, the Wheatfield Road, which was laid out in the 1840s. Seminary Ridge, where the tree line is on the west side of the Emmitsburg Road. And the property extended down towards the area where Hood's division had attacked. And the original boundary of the property was all the way to the base of Little Round Top and included the Valley of Death and Devil's Den. Joseph Scherfy, or Scherfig, died in 1842. His wife Catherine died in 1844, and an interim owner sold off some of the tracts of land to other people. So, like we said, it's about 230 acres at the time of the battle. But if we take this Scherfig Rose tract of land, during the battle, some 25,000 soldiers, about 14,000 Northerners and 11,000 Southerners crossed this ground, or fought on this ground. The units that fought here suffered approximately 9,000 casualties on July 2nd, 1863, all after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, I haven't done a statistical analysis of all the farmlands that were involved in Civil War battles, but I will bet that the Rose Farm is the bloodiest single tract of land in American history. The Rose farmhouse that we can see in the distance, the stone farmhouse, we're not sure when it was built. We have a 1798 tax, and Joseph Scherfig is listed on it. He's probably a squatter prior to getting the patent deed, or had purchased the survey or the warrant from a previous owner. That's very confusing. But he had a log house, an old log house, according to the 1798 tax. The stone house here was probably built about 1820. We are missing tax records for a period in Cumberland Township, so we'll never know the exact date. According to Scherfig family legend, the house was built with 250 wagon loads of stone gathered from areas around the farm, and probably near Big Round Top. Of course, Devil's Den is filled with stones. The barn required an additional 340 wagon loads of stone. The stone portion of the Rose barn actually was kind of dilapidated, but the stones were intact until the 1980s when the park dismantled the barn. The pieces have been preserved, some in the base of the barn, some in other storage places. And so, long-range plans could include restoring the Rose barn to its Civil War appearance. In the 1860 census, John Rose and his wife Ann are living at this location with their 6 children. The tenant farmer, Francis Ogden, is listed with his wife, and they have 7 children. The oldest child was Charles Francis Ogden. He had enlisted in Company B, 138th Pennsylvania Volunteers, and was killed in the fighting in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. So in the 1860 census, there's like 17 people living in this house. I wanted to point out that we have a couple fascinating pieces of documents that tie into this farm. One is the Elliott burial map, which just shows a huge amount of burials on this property after the fighting. I don't think anybody thinks that the map is entirely accurate, but it shows way too many dead on the property, but you get the idea. And also, we have photographs taken on this property by Alexander Gardner and his crew after the battle was over. He arrived and was taking photographs here a few days after the fighting and recorded some of the more gruesome images recorded during the entire Civil War. As a matter of fact, the images taken here on top of the hill behind the Rose Farm represent the largest grouping of soldiers and the largest number of photographs taken of one group of dead soldiers during the entire Civil War. We also have the claims files of George Rose, John Rose, and Francis Ogden. And together, their claims exceed $4,500, one of the largest claims for a single farm in Adams County during the Civil War. And also, we have quotes about the aftermath here when people visited the farm in 1863. One of the best is from a guy named John Lynn, who visited the farm on July 8th, 1863. Here to the north of the barn, we counted 33 graves of the 12th South Carolina Volunteers. They were only slightly covered with earth, and you could feel the body by pressing the earth with your foot. One man's left hand, J.B. Robbins, Company I, 8th South Carolina Volunteers, stuck out of the ground looking like an old, parched, well-worn buckskin glove. On the other side of the barn and the lane under a pear tree was a grave of Captain T.J. Warren. And in the garden, Mr. Rose told us were buried 10 superior officers, colonels, majors, etc. That morning, he had them removed for fear of injury to his well, to a ravine in the woods a half a mile east of his house, where he placed the headboards beside them and left them unburied, not having the strength or means to bury them. He pointed up to his wheat field and said 50 rebels were lying there still unburied. And that was July 8th. And probably the most dramatic account that speaks of the Rose Farm is from J. Howard Wirt. I know in the past I've said that he's not the most reliable source for facts, but he's a great storyteller. And his aunt, I believe, was his wife's aunt, I think, had purchased this farm in the 1880s with her husband. And his son had worked on this farm for a while. And he writes in one of his books, I was on the Rose Farm and around the Rose buildings immediately after hostilities ceased. It was about the most gruesome thing of the many gruesome spectacles on the Gettysburg field. The little marshy stream in front of the house was clogged with Confederate dead. When the heavy rains came down, so much was the flow of water obstructed that great ponds were formed, the dams being the swollen corpses. A much disgusted man was Rose when he returned. His stock was gone. His furniture was gone. His house was filled with filthy clothing and vermin. His supply of drinking water polluted with dead bodies. Nothing left of his farm but the rocks and some soil. Nearly 100 Confederates were buried in his garden, some 175 behind his barn and around his wagon shed. Graves were scattered through the lawns adjoining the house. One Confederate colonel being buried within a yard of his kitchen door. No one farm on the widely extended battlefield probably drank as much blood as did the Rose Farm. And remember, if you like all the content that we put on our YouTube channel, please like and subscribe.